The year was 1962, and Boston was a city caught between tradition and transformation. Families lived in brick apartments, men worked factory jobs, and women carried groceries home from corner shops. Life was simple, predictable, and for the most part safe. But that sense of safety would not last. On a warm June evening, the illusion of security shattered. The body of a middle-aged woman was found in her modest home, strangled with the sash of her own robe. At first, police whispered it was an isolated tragedy, the kind of rare brutality that occasionally shook even the safest neighborhoods. But Boston was about to learn that this was no accident. It was the beginning of something far darker. As weeks passed, more bodies surfaced. Elderly women, often living alone, discovered in their bedrooms, strangled, humiliated, sometimes arranged in grotesque positions. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered glass. Whoever this killer was, he was persuasive enough to be let inside. That was what terrified people the most. The women weren't just victims of violence. They were victims of trust. Whispers spread quickly across the city. Newspapers splashed headlines warning women to keep their doors locked and never trust a stranger. Radios carried grim reports of yet another killing. Soon, the name was born, the Boston Strangler. It was catchy, terrifying, and it stuck. Panic seeped into everyday life. Women who had once strolled freely down the tree-lined streets now walked in pairs, eyes darting at every shadow. Hardware stores sold out of locks and chains. The city's most intimate spaces, apartments, bedrooms, even bathrooms, no longer felt safe. Boston was transforming from a proud, bustling city into a hunting ground. But what no one realized in those early months was that the Boston Strangler was not just one of America's most notorious serial killers. His story would become one of the most controversial mysteries in criminal history. A case built on shaky confessions, questionable evidence, and lingering doubt that refuses to die, even decades later. For the people who lived through it, the summer of 1962 was not just another year. It was the year fear took a new name, and that name was the Boston Strangler. June 14, 1962. It was a humid summer evening when neighbors of 55-year-old Anna Sleezers, a seamstress and mother, noticed something unusual. Her apartment door was locked, her curtains drawn, and the usually familiar sounds of daily life, the clinking of dishes, the radio playing softly, had gone silent. When her son arrived and forced his way in, he discovered a sight so horrifying that it would mark the beginning of one of America's darkest chapters. Anna lay sprawled in her bathroom. The belt of her bathrobe had been tied tightly around her neck, leaving deep grooves in her skin. The apartment itself showed no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no ransacked drawers. Whoever had done this had been let in willingly or had somehow convinced Anna to open her door. Even more chilling, the killer had left behind no fingerprints, no obvious weapon, nothing to identify him, just silence and death. The police at first were hesitant to sound alarms. They treated Anna's death as a personal crime. Maybe a burglary gone wrong, or the act of someone she knew. But there was something different here. She hadn't just been murdered, she had been posed. Her body was left in a manner that felt deliberate, staged, almost ritualistic. To investigators, this was not a robbery. This was a message. Still, officials chose to downplay it. One murder, even a brutal one, didn't justify panic in a city as large as Boston. The newspapers reported the killing in short columns, avoiding sensational headlines. But behind closed doors, detectives were unsettled. The lack of forced entry meant the killer could be anyone: a neighbor, a delivery man, even someone in uniform. And worse, the confidence shown by the killer suggested this wasn't the end. For Anna's family, grief turned quickly into confusion. How could a woman of modest means, with no enemies, become the victim of such a savage attack? For Boston, her death was just another crime statistic. No one yet knew that Anna Sleezers was the first victim of a predator who would soon hold an entire city hostage to fear. In the days that followed, life in Boston returned to normal. Children played in the streets, shops opened, and families gathered for Sunday dinners. But beneath that surface calm, the clock was already ticking. The Strangler had claimed his first life, and he was only getting started. Only 2 weeks after the murder of Anna Sleezers, another woman was found dead in eerily similar circumstances. This time, it was 68-year-old Mary Mullen. She was discovered in her home, her body showing signs of asphyxiation. The cause of death was initially dismissed as a heart attack, but detectives began to whisper among themselves. The similarities to Anna's case were hard to ignore. Then, barely days later, 75-year-old Nina Nichols was discovered strangled with her own stockings, her apartment left undisturbed. Within 24 hours, yet another body turned up, 67-year-old Helen Blake, strangled with her own bra and found sprawled across her bed in a carefully posed position. Now, Boston could no longer look away. These were not isolated tragedies. They were connected by a chilling thread. Women, all elderly, all living alone, all strangled with their own belongings. And in each case, the killer left behind almost nothing. No broken locks, no signs of forced entry, no clear motive. It was as though he was a ghost, slipping quietly into apartments, charming his way past locked doors, and vanishing without a trace. What terrified people most wasn't just the brutality of the killings, but the suggestion that these women trusted him enough to let him inside. By the time the fifth victim, 65-year-old Ida Irga, was found, the newspapers had already given the killer his name: the Boston Strangler. The press thrived on fear, and the phrase alone was enough to freeze the city. Front pages screamed warnings, radio announcers repeated grim details, and families whispered about the killings at dinner tables. For the women of Boston, paranoia became routine. They checked their locks twice, then 3 times. Neighbors began watching strangers with suspicion. Even the most familiar faces, the milkman, the handyman, the policeman, suddenly seemed dangerous. The idea that the killer could be anyone was more terrifying than the murders themselves. Investigators, meanwhile, were overwhelmed. More detectives were pulled into the case, but the lack of evidence made progress almost impossible. Each victim only deepened the mystery. If the killer could strike this easily and this often, who would be next? Boston was beginning to realize a nightmare truth. The murders weren't stopping. They were escalating. By late summer of 1962, Boston was no longer just whispering about the murders. The city was screaming. Newspapers splashed gruesome headlines across their front pages. The words were bold, terrifying, impossible to ignore. The Boston Strangler strikes again. Radio broadcasts opened with grim updates, and television anchors leaned into the panic, their voices low, dramatic, and ominous. The press understood something the police didn't. Fear sells. Readers devoured every detail, real or exaggerated. Reporters described the killer as a phantom moving through locked doors, a man capable of charming his way into the homes of lonely women before turning their bedrooms into crime scenes. They painted Boston not as a city, but as a hunting ground. Soon, rumors began to spread faster than facts. Some articles suggested the Strangler was a doctor, able to calm women with his professional manner. Others speculated he was a repairman, someone women would trust to let inside. A few even whispered about multiple killers, a network of predators working together. The lack of evidence only fueled wild theories, and each new victim seemed to confirm the press's most sensational predictions. Police officials bristled at the coverage. They accused reporters of exaggeration, of turning a complex investigation into a circus. But even as they complained, detectives privately admitted the media pressure was working. The city was mobilized. Women were locking their doors, neighborhoods were organizing watches, and the fear of the Strangler had made everyone more alert. Yet the downside was undeniable. Hysteria made people reckless. Innocent men were accused on street corners, strangers attacked for being suspicious, and tip lines were flooded with thousands of dead ends. In barbershops, diners, and churches, the Strangler became the only topic of conversation. Some women carried knives in their handbags, others slept with lights on, and elderly widows begged relatives to stay overnight. Boston had become a city living in collective dread. The killer, however, seemed to thrive in this environment. Each new headline felt like fuel, each front page spread like a trophy. As the press turned him into a household name, the Strangler grew bolder. And Boston, once proud of its safety, its quiet neighborhoods and its sense of community, now felt trapped in a horror story it could not escape. The media had done more than report on the murders. They had immortalized the Strangler. As the body count rose, so did the anger. The people of Boston were terrified, but their fear soon turned into frustration. Frustration directed squarely at the police. Why, they asked, with all the detectives and manpower, had the killer not been caught? Why were women continuing to die in their own homes while the police seemed to be steps behind? The Boston Police Department found itself in a storm. Detectives worked long hours chasing down every lead, but the investigation was drowning in contradictions. There was no clear suspect, no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry. Every clue seemed to vanish into thin air, as if the Strangler himself were mocking the investigators. Worse still, jurisdictional disputes crippled progress. The murders stretched across multiple districts, each with its own chain of command. Boston PD, the Massachusetts State Police, and even the Attorney General's office wanted control of the case. Instead of cooperation, turf wars erupted. Files were duplicated, evidence misplaced, and valuable time wasted in bureaucratic battles while the killer remained free. The press seized on this chaos, accusing the police of incompetence. Editorials demanded resignations. Citizens wrote letters to newspapers pleading for stronger action. Even politicians began stepping in, sensing the public outrage as an opportunity to advance their careers. The mayor promised increased patrols. State officials promised more resources. Yet on the streets, the promises meant nothing. The murders continued. Inside police headquarters, tension was unbearable. Detectives who had once taken pride in their work now dreaded each morning, waiting for the inevitable call. Another body. Officers patrolled neighborhoods in pairs, but it was impossible to guard every door, every apartment, every elderly woman living alone. The Strangler was everywhere and nowhere, invisible yet omnipresent. Some investigators whispered their own doubts. maybe they weren't even dealing with one killer. The sudden changes in victim profiles, the varying methods, the inconsistencies, all suggested a more complicated truth. But higher-ups refused to entertain such theories. They wanted a single name, a single monster they could pin these horrors on. The public needed closure, and the department needed a scapegoat. As 1962 bled into 1963, the police weren't just chasing a killer. They were fighting for their reputation, their careers, and the trust of an entire city. And with every unsolved murder, that trust crumbled further. Boston had become a city at war with fear, and the police were losing. By early 1963, Boston no longer felt like Boston. It was a city under siege, not by an invading army, but by a single shadowy figure no one could identify. The Strangler didn't just kill his victims. He killed the very sense of safety that held neighborhoods together. Women who once left their windows open during summer nights now hammered them shut. Hardware stores sold out of locks, bolts, and chains. Locksmiths worked around the clock, drilling steel plates into doors. In apartment buildings, tenants created their own watch systems, checking in on each other at night, making sure no one lived alone without someone calling daily. The smallest creak in a hallway, the faintest knock at a door, was enough to send chills down spines. For single women, paranoia became a daily companion. They checked behind curtains before undressing, left radios on to give the illusion of company, and refused to answer the door unless they knew the voice on the other side. Mothers lectured their daughters. Grown children begged their elderly parents not to live alone. In some neighborhoods, women began sleeping in groups, pulling mattresses into living rooms to feel less vulnerable. The social life of the city collapsed. Dinner parties were canceled. Cafes that once bustled with conversation emptied out after dark. Nighttime streets were deserted, with only the occasional police patrol cutting through the silence. Churches prayed for deliverance. Bars traded laughter for hushed conversations about who might be next. Men, too, felt the strain. Husbands and sons were suddenly responsible for escorting female relatives everywhere, from grocery runs to evening church services. Strangers on the street, especially men, were viewed with suspicion. Even those who meant no harm found themselves watched, judged, and sometimes accused. The Strangler had managed something extraordinary. He had turned a modern American city into a place where every shadow carried menace. Fear became the great equalizer. Rich or poor, young or old, no one felt immune. For Boston, daily life had transformed into survival. Each locked door, each tightened chain, each whispered warning was a ritual against an invisible enemy. And yet, no matter how much the city locked itself away, the murders didn't stop. The predator was still out there, watching, waiting, ready to strike again. For months, the Boston Strangler had seemed predictable in his horror. His victims were almost always elderly women, living alone, strangled with items from their own homes. Detectives, though frustrated at their lack of progress, at least believed they understood his pattern. But then, just as the city adjusted to this grim expectation, everything changed. In December 1962, the body of 23-year-old Sophie Clark was discovered in her apartment. Unlike the earlier victims, Sophie was not elderly, nor was she living in isolation. She was a vibrant young woman with a promising future, working as a nurse. Her death shocked the city. If even young women were not safe, then the Strangler's reach was wider and more terrifying than anyone had imagined. Weeks later, 21-year-old Patricia Bissett, a secretary, was found strangled in her own apartment. Like Sophie, she was young, attractive, and independent. Suddenly, the killer's profile shifted from preying on the vulnerable elderly to targeting women in the prime of their lives. The change raised disturbing questions. Was this really the same killer, or had the media frenzy inspired a copycat? The methods were similar: strangulation with personal items, staged positioning. Yet the age gap between early and later victims was too significant to ignore. Some detectives argued this suggested multiple killers. Others believed it was a single predator evolving, experimenting, growing bolder with each kill. The uncertainty only deepened the fear. Now, no woman in Boston felt safe. Daughters who once pitied their elderly mothers now realized they were just as vulnerable. College students locked themselves into dormitories. Young professionals quit jobs to avoid living alone. The city, once only gripped by fear for its elderly, now believed the Strangler could choose anyone. Investigators were left paralyzed. The shift in victims shattered whatever fragile sense of order they thought they had. Every woman, young or old, rich or poor, was now a potential target. The case files thickened, the contradictions grew, and the police had no answers. For the Strangler, if it was indeed one man, this sudden change was proof of something chilling. He was in complete control. He dictated the rules. He shifted the narrative, and Boston had no choice but to follow in terror. By 1964, Boston was drowning in fear. The newspapers ran front-page stories almost daily. The city's women double-checked their locks at night, and police pressure was at its breaking point. Detectives had no clear suspect. Every tip led nowhere. Every lead collapsed. But then, unexpectedly, a petty criminal already behind bars for unrelated charges began to talk, and the name Albert DeSalvo entered the narrative. DeSalvo was hardly the monstrous figure the public imagined. He was a construction worker, husband, and father of two. To neighbors, he was ordinary, quiet, polite, and unremarkable. Yet behind closed doors, he harbored disturbing compulsions. DeSalvo had a long history of criminal behavior, mostly involving burglary and sexual assaults. Police already knew him as the Measuring Man, a prowler who conned his way into women's homes by pretending to be a modeling scout, asking them to strip so he could take measurements. Later, he was dubbed the Green Man for breaking into apartments and assaulting women while wearing workman's clothing. While imprisoned for a series of unrelated crimes, DeSalvo reportedly confessed to fellow inmate George Nassar that he was the infamous Boston Strangler. Nassar, a convicted murderer, quickly saw opportunity and tipped off authorities. Soon, investigators were sitting across from DeSalvo, listening in disbelief as he calmly recounted details of murders that had never been made public. DeSalvo's memory of crime scenes was eerily precise. He described the layout of apartments, the positions of bodies, and even the knots used in the strangulation. Details so specific they convinced some investigators he had in fact been there. For the first time, the Boston police felt they had their man. But there was a problem. DeSalvo's confession was not recorded in court under oath, and he was never formally charged with any of the Boston Strangler murders. There was no physical evidence linking him directly to the crimes. It was his word alone. Some detectives argued that DeSalvo might simply be a compulsive confessor, taking credit for killings he hadn't committed. Others believed his detailed knowledge could only come from the true killer himself. Regardless, the city latched onto his name. Headlines branded Albert DeSalvo as the Boston Strangler, the monster who had terrorized Boston for years. For the public, a face had finally been put to the horror, but in the shadows of the investigation, doubts continued to grow. When the name Albert DeSalvo hit the headlines, Boston collectively exhaled for the first time in years. Newspapers printed his face alongside lurid descriptions of his supposed crimes. Radio programs dissected every detail of his confessions. For a terrified public desperate for closure, it was simple. The nightmare had a name, and that name was Albert DeSalvo. But the reality inside the courtroom was far murkier. DeSalvo was never officially charged with the Boston Strangler murders. Instead, prosecutors pursued him for a series of earlier sexual assaults and burglaries, crimes tied to his Measuring Man and Green Man escapades. The reason was simple. Despite his vivid confessions, there was no physical evidence tying him to the string of strangulations. No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon. Just his words. Yet the confessions alone were enough to captivate the press and public. Reporters flooded the courtroom, scribbling down every strange detail DeSalvo gave about the killings. Some jurors admitted privately that they felt as though they were staring at a man who had looked into the abyss. To many, it no longer mattered what. Either the evidence was airtight. The city wanted resolution, and DeSalvo was the most convenient answer. His defense attorney, the famed F. Lee Bailey, who would later gain notoriety in the O.J. Simpson trial, tried to argue that DeSalvo was mentally ill and deserved psychiatric treatment rather than prison. Bailey suggested his client's compulsive need to confess and his disturbing obsession with women pointed to a deeply unstable mind. But the prosecution pressed forward, focusing on crimes they could prove rather than the headline-grabbing murders. In 1967, Albert DeSalvo was sentenced to life imprisonment for multiple counts of assault and robbery. The trial never once convicted him as the Boston Strangler. Still, for most of Boston, and for much of America, the verdict didn't matter. To them, DeSalvo was the Strangler. But beneath the public relief, unease lingered. Investigators quietly admitted the case didn't add up. The shift in victim profiles, the inconsistencies in his stories, the lack of physical evidence, none of it sat comfortably. Was DeSalvo really the monster who terrorized Boston? Or had the city simply closed its case on the wrong man? The trial may have ended, but the story of the Boston Strangler was far from over. Albert DeSalvo entered prison in 1967 as a man already branded by the media as the Boston Strangler, despite never being convicted for those murders. To fellow inmates, he was both feared and ridiculed. Some saw him as a notorious figure, others as a fraud who had confessed to crimes he hadn't committed. Either way, DeSalvo was a man who could not escape the shadow of the Strangler's legend. Inside the prison walls, DeSalvo's behavior remained peculiar. He alternated between quiet compliance and unsettling boasts about his past. At times, he claimed to have killed far more women than the public ever knew. At other times, he denied being the Strangler altogether. Inmates and guards alike couldn't tell if he was seeking attention, playing mind games, or finally revealing cracks in his own lies. In the early 1970s, DeSalvo began to reach out beyond the prison. He reportedly told family members and attorneys that he wanted to come clean once and for all, promising new details about the Boston murders that had never been shared before. Rumors spread that he was preparing to make a formal confession that might either confirm or debunk the entire case against him. But that confession never came. On the night of November 25, 1973, Albert DeSalvo was found stabbed to death in the infirmary wing of Walpole State Prison. He had been stabbed 16 times. His killer was never identified. Some inmates claimed it was a revenge attack. Others whispered that he had been silenced because he knew too much and was about to expose secrets that powerful people didn't want revealed. What made his death even more chilling was its timing. Hours before he was killed, DeSalvo had phoned his lawyer, telling him he had finally decided to tell the full truth. He said he would reveal everything about the Boston Strangler case the next morning. That morning never came. The murder of Albert DeSalvo only deepened the mystery. If he really was the Boston Strangler, then justice had been cut short. If he wasn't, then the true killer may have walked free, while the only man who claimed responsibility was silenced forever. For Boston, DeSalvo's death didn't close the case. It cracked it wide open. For decades after Albert DeSalvo's prison death, the Boston Strangler case lingered in a haze of uncertainty. Many believed the city had executed a convenient cover-up, pinning the murders on a man already gone. Others argued DeSalvo was indeed guilty, but without solid proof, the truth remained locked in speculation. That changed in the 21st century, when modern forensic science stepped into the story. In 2013, nearly 50 years after the murders, investigators revisited the case of Mary Sullivan, the Strangler's final known victim. Sullivan's body had been found in her Boston apartment in January 1964. At the time, the case yielded no physical evidence conclusive enough to convict anyone, but her family never stopped searching for answers. Advances in DNA testing finally gave them, and the city, a new chance. Authorities exhumed DeSalvo's body, collecting genetic material to compare against evidence preserved from Sullivan's crime scene. The results stunned even seasoned investigators. DNA found on Sullivan's remains and on a blanket in her apartment matched Albert DeSalvo's genetic profile with near certainty. After decades of debate, science had tied him directly to at least one of the murders. The announcement sent shockwaves through Boston. For some, it was the long-awaited confirmation. Albert DeSalvo really was the Boston Strangler. For others, it solved only part of the puzzle. Yes, the DNA proved his guilt in Sullivan's murder, but what about the other 12? Many experts still argued the inconsistencies in victim profiles and crime details pointed to more than one killer. Some suggested DeSalvo committed some murders, while copycats were responsible for others. The case's modern chapter also raised an unsettling question. Why had it taken so long? If DNA had been available in the 1960s, DeSalvo's guilt or innocence could have been proven decades earlier, sparing Boston years of uncertainty. Instead, the city lived in fear and the truth remained. Buried until technology finally caught up. Even today, the Boston Strangler murders remain partly unresolved. Science has answered some questions but left others hanging. Was DeSalvo the lone predator, or merely one face in a larger nightmare? The DNA evidence brought closure for Mary Sullivan's family, but for Boston, the legend of the Strangler still lingers like a shadow. From the moment the first headlines screamed of a mad strangler haunting Boston, the case became more than a police investigation. It became a media obsession. Newspapers splashed graphic details across their front pages, often exaggerating elements to stoke public fear. Radio broadcasters warned women to lock their doors, while television anchors speculated about whether the killer was a lone madman or part of a sinister network. This frenzy shaped how the public perceived the crimes. Instead of quiet investigation, the Strangler was turned into a cultural monster. Each new murder wasn't just a tragedy, it was entertainment for a city hungry for answers. Reporters camped outside crime scenes, photographers captured grieving families, and headlines reduced real victims into gruesome caricatures. The lonely widow, the nursing student, the final girl. Hollywood soon seized the opportunity. In 1968, just a few years after the murders, The Boston Strangler, starring Tony Curtis, was released. The film dramatized Albert DeSalvo's life and confessions, presenting him as the definitive killer despite lingering doubts. Though criticized for blurring fact and fiction, the movie cemented the Strangler in American pop culture as a household name. Books and documentaries followed, each one spinning the story through a different lens. Some portrayed DeSalvo as the cunning predator who outwitted police. Others painted him as a troubled man exploited by sensationalism, perhaps even innocent of most of the crimes attributed to him. Each retelling kept the case alive, ensuring it never slipped quietly into history. In the decades since, the Strangler has been referenced in countless crime shows, podcasts, and films. Even recent true crime streaming series revisit the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about media hysteria and investigative failures. The image of women alone in their Boston apartments, vulnerable, terrified, waiting for footsteps outside their door, remains one of the most chilling cultural imprints of the 1960s. The case also left a lasting mark on policing and journalism. Investigators learned hard lessons about handling serial crime investigations, while reporters grappled with their own role in fueling public panic. The Strangler wasn't just a killer. He was a mirror, reflecting a society where fear and spectacle often overshadowed truth. In the end, the Boston Strangler became more than a name. He became a story, retold, reimagined, and rebranded endlessly. Proof that sometimes horror lives on not in the crime itself, but in the way we choose to remember it. Even after DNA evidence tied Albert DeSalvo to the murder of Mary Sullivan, the last of the Boston Strangler's victims, a cloud of uncertainty still hung over the case. For many investigators, criminologists, and even families of the victims, the question was never fully answered. Was DeSalvo truly the Strangler, or just one piece of a much darker puzzle? One of the strongest arguments against DeSalvo being the sole killer lies in the changing victim profile. The first wave of murders targeted elderly, isolated women. Then suddenly, the victims shifted to young independent women like Sophie Clark and Patricia Bissett. This kind of drastic change is rare for serial killers who usually stick to a type. Did DeSalvo evolve that dramatically? Or were copycats taking advantage of the fear he created? Some detectives at the time believed there were multiple killers, each committing murders that were lumped together under the Strangler umbrella. The chaos of overlapping investigations combined with media hysteria blurred distinctions between the crimes. In the rush to calm public fear, perhaps too many cases were tied to one convenient suspect. There are also doubts about DeSalvo's confessions. He provided chillingly accurate details, but critics argue those could have been fed to him by police, reporters, or fellow inmates. Known as a compulsive talker and eager to please, DeSalvo may have exaggerated or fabricated stories to gain notoriety. After all, he was never formally charged with a single Strangler murder. Then there's the matter of his prison death. Stabbed 16 times just as he claimed he was ready to tell the truth, DeSalvo's killing only fueled speculation that someone wanted him silenced. If he wasn't the Strangler, perhaps he was about to reveal who was, a revelation some powerful figure didn't want exposed. Conspiracy theories thrive in that uncertainty. Some suggest organized crime may have played a role, while others suspect multiple predators operated independently. Their crimes conveniently merged into one monster by a desperate police force. To this day, Boston remains divided. For many, the DNA evidence is enough to close the case. For others, the inconsistencies, the unanswered questions, and the eerie silence of DeSalvo's final hours keep the doubts alive. The Boston Strangler may have been caught, or he may still be nothing more than a shadow, hiding behind the legend of a man who claimed to be him. The Boston Strangler murders didn't just claim lives. They reshaped the very soul of a city. In the early 1960s, Boston was a place of tight-knit neighborhoods where women felt safe living alone. Doors were often left unlocked, and neighbors trusted one another. The Strangler shattered that illusion. As the killings mounted, fear seeped into every corner of daily life. Women stopped walking the streets after dark. Apartment buildings filled with whispers and rumors about who might be next. Locksmiths saw their businesses boom as panicked residents demanded new deadbolts and chains. Some women even stuffed furniture against their doors before going to sleep. The sense of safety that once defined Boston homes was gone. The terror also carried a generational weight. Mothers warned daughters never to trust a stranger, advice that hardened into a permanent rule of life. The image of a killer slipping into apartments, strangling women with their own stockings or scarves, created a cultural trauma that lasted decades. Even after DeSalvo's arrest and death, the city remained haunted by the idea that the Strangler could still be out there, waiting. Beyond the fear itself, the case highlighted the failures of law enforcement and the justice system. With multiple police jurisdictions competing for control, investigations were often chaotic and fragmented. Evidence was mishandled, leads went cold, and opportunities were missed. For many Bostonians, the Strangler case became a symbol of how institutions meant to protect them could falter when fear and politics collided. The media's role only amplified the paranoia. By sensationalizing every detail, newspapers and broadcasters turned the Strangler into a near-mythic villain. While the coverage sold papers, it also spread panic faster than the police could contain it. For years afterward, Boston lived with the uneasy knowledge that its darkest chapter had been as much a media spectacle as a crime spree. Even today, the phrase Boston Strangler evokes a shiver. It has become shorthand for vulnerability, a reminder that evil can strike in the most intimate of places, your own home. Boston rebuilt, of course, but the murders left behind an invisible scar, teaching the city a brutal lesson about fear, trust, and the shadows that lurk behind locked doors. More than half a century has passed since the Boston Strangler terrorized an entire city. Yet the case still lingers in America's collective memory. It is not just the brutality of the murders that keeps the story alive, but the shadows of doubt that refuse to fade. Albert DeSalvo's name has been etched into history as the Strangler, but even now, certainty escapes us. DNA evidence ties him to Mary Sullivan's death, yet the contradictions in his confessions and the drastic shifts in victim profiles leave room for unsettling possibilities. Was he the sole killer, or merely one predator among several? Did the police, under enormous public pressure, allow the truth to be blurred for the sake of closure? These questions remain unanswered, echoing louder with each retelling of the story. For Boston, the murders were more than crimes. They were an invasion of trust. Homes, once sanctuaries, became places of dread. Women, whether elderly or young, realized that the very walls around them could not guarantee safety. That trauma carved itself into the identity of the city, a reminder of vulnerability that would never fully disappear. The Strangler case also exposed the dangers of sensationalism. The media's frenzy turned real human tragedies into public spectacle, immortalizing the killer in headlines while the victims became footnotes. It blurred truth and myth until even today, separating fact from fiction feels impossible. Perhaps that is why the Boston Strangler still fascinates. He embodies the unknown, the part of crime history that resists resolution. Unlike other notorious killers whose guilt was proven beyond doubt, the Strangler's legacy thrives on uncertainty. He is not just a figure from the past, he is a question that refuses to be answered. And maybe that's the most chilling part. The Strangler's story is not only about who he was, but about what he left behind. Fear, doubt, and the haunting realization that evil can hide in the ordinary, wear the face of a family man, and slip into lives unnoticed until it is far too late. The Boston Strangler may be gone, but the silence he left, the unanswered questions, the lingering shadows, ensures that his presence will never truly disappear. The city may have moved on, but the ghost of the Strangler still walks Boston's streets.